Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Thanks, and glad to be back. So this is episode 32, and we're recording this on April 16th, 2023.
On this episode, I speak with Bates Gill, the executive director of the Center for China Analysis with the Asia Society Policy Institute. We discuss the troubling aspects of China's military modernization, the rise of military-industrial technocrats to leadership positions in the Communist Party, and the importance of understanding China from the inside out. We begin the show with an update on the Russia-Ukraine war, focusing on the recent intelligence leaks. We also consider whether there are limits in the West's support to the Ukrainian war effort. China is not the only country talking about a multipolar world. We discuss Macron's infamous trip to China and his attempt to carve out a unique foreign policy agenda for Europe while setting himself up to be a distinguished statesman. Brazil's President Lulu also visited with Xi this week with proposals for a closer relationship with China and greater global influence for Brazil. So what's been going on with us the last couple of weeks?
I think we've just been taking advantage of the warmer weather. It has been unusually warm here, getting up into the upper 80s and 90s, which I think has been pretty close to record-breaking. But, obviously this is was a couple of weeks ago, the cherry blossom peak around the tidal basin. So we took advantage of that. We've taken a couple other small trips around too, just finally checking out some more of the museums and areas around Washington to explore. So what was your favorite? So you missed the Cherry Blossom Festival last year. What kind of stood out to you?
Yeah, well, the cherry blossoms, were beautiful. And you have that iconic image of where you see the Jefferson Memorial, through the lens of cherry blossoms, which you'll see in any book about DC. We'll have a picture of that. Mm-hmm. So you get to see that. No, it's always beautiful. It's always something that you have to experience. You can't quite capture in pictures. But we went to an art exhibit last weekend, I think, with an exhibit from Udaipur, which is where the wedding in India was, and highlighting the art from that area. And it was gorgeous. And I loved how they did the exhibit. They wanted to immerse all your senses. So they had sounds of water, because Udaipur is all about these lakes and water, and, getting to hear that and kind of feel that atmosphere while looking at these paintings. And one of the most amazing things about these paintings, I don't even understand how they do, is if you get a magnifying glass, you can see these perfect details. And I'm wondering how amazing their eyesight must have been to make these details of all these aspects of the paintings.
Yeah, no, it was really impressive and well done. And yeah, it was a nice little capstone, having been there less than a month before, to visit that and kind of have that all kind of fresh in your mind. I will say our daughter only appreciated the photos that showed the hotel that we stayed at and none of the artwork.
Yeah. We tease her because she loves art. She wants to be an artist, and yet she hates art museums.
Yeah. We'll have to continue to work on her about that.
I know people have always asked me, have you been to all the museums? And I'm I have a 10-year-old who hates museums. So it's kind of slow going.
Yeah, she's gotten better. She's good for an hour or so now. I guess it used to be 10 minutes. Incremental progress.
But yeah, it's been a really nice spring. And then I found out finally there's these pink puffy blossoms.
How did you find out what they're called?
Yeah, they're Japanese cherry flowering trees. So they're different type of cherry blossom in essence.
Oh, okay.
They're so pretty.
Yeah, they're really pretty.
Yeah. Well, I hope you guys have been having a good spring too. So on with it?
Yep.
So we begin with an update on the Russia-Ukraine war, with incorporating the recent intelligence leaks that have come out about the status of the war. Much of the news has focused on the culprit of the leaks, but we wanted to talk about what actual intelligence that was gathered and that everyone learned about this week.
Yeah, so looking at kind of where the war is at since our last update, probably a couple episodes ago, now at this point. There hasn't been a lot of movement on the ground. So the actual activity and battle really continues to focus around Bakhmut, which it has for the last 3 or 4 months. But I think what's been interesting from this leak that you mentioned, which came from a 21-year-old Massachusetts Air National Guardsman who was arrested by the FBI, but there were some nuggets in there that reinforced what the narrative that was out there. There were a couple of surprises, but I think as things fall out, we're not really seeing anything that will have a strategic implication on the war. But it does reinforce kind of some of the concerns and the worries that were floated out there by certain analysts.
To it a little bit more, I do want to ask you a question because it does seem like there are some strategic implications.
Yeah, but I think the more that comes out, I don't think it necessarily is going to change any of the actions carried out within the war. I mean, I think there's probably the question of more on the Russian side, that some of these documents reveal specifics on how the U.S. has penetrated the Russian intelligence network. So there may be defensive measures that the Russians introduce that kind of eliminate that. But I don't think any of the things that reveal that we're going to talk about are surprising necessarily in terms of
even about
the Ukrainian current status of the battlefield, the lack of ammunition, the reduced timetable that potentially exists for them. I think these were things that were probably bubbling up. Maybe people are a little bit more open about it because, now this is out in the open as opposed to being in top secret classifications.
You don't think we should be worried about having specifically, Ukraine is going to run out of air defense ammunition by May, and that gives Russia maybe a chance to wait for any assaults and then be more free about using this air force that we haven't seen yet?
Yeah, I don't think necessarily. I don't think any of these things were secret or unknown, and it doesn't really reduce the risk of that the Russians would still run. They don't. One, this is dated information from several months ago. They don't know the exact deployments of the more modern Western equipment that's coming in. So they've been very reluctant because they know, and part of this may be a function of the benefit of the sanctions that have been put in place, is that when the Russians lose a jet, it's not easily replaced. So they've been very reluctant to deploy it because they took pretty heavy losses in the early stages of the war. And then the Air Force essentially has been missing. That's why they've gone with cruise missiles and with cheaper Iranian drones.
Mm-hmm. That's all true. Although when I was listening to the news today, the documents are not all of them are that old. One was only 40 days. So some of them have been kind of current.
It's still enough of a date. But yeah, it was a lot more current than they would like to see that's out there for sure. So anyway, going back to the battlefront, so Bakhmut, again, has been a stalemate. I think the leaked documents made it clear that in February, there was great concern within the U.S. military that the Ukrainian forces are being operationally encircled, and that effectively only a single supply road is keeping Ukraine troops within the city in the fight. So there is this questioning, again, within these intelligence documents on the choice to defend Bakhmut, which we've talked about in a number of previous episodes, that Bakhmut isn't strategically that important, but it's taken on an outsized political significance to both, first for the Russians, for the reasons we discussed before, where after the losses during the fall, for them to kind of take a stand and regain territory. It's also a proving ground for the Wagner mercenary group and for their founder, Prigozhin, to make a real push within Russian leadership. So for these reasons, it's kind of both sides have been stubbornly defending, and it's turned into a real meat grinder to the extent, I mean, the losses on the Russian side and to a lesser extent on the Ukrainian side have been massive. I mean, 20 to 30,000 Russian troops are thought to have been killed or wounded just within the last month, which makes it the bloodiest battle in Europe since World War II.
I just want to talk about the Wagner Group a little bit because that absolutely fascinates me. In fact, I kind of was concurrently hearing about them at the beginning of the Ukraine war, but also this talk about Libya and how active they are and sort of the warlords fighting in Libya, keeping them in power. So there were some interesting aspects in one of the articles about them, about one, that even with what's happening with Russia, Ukraine, how they're involved in all kinds of Africa and all kinds of developing countries, providing security to government regimes, to warlords, to arm deals. And one of the interesting aspects of that article was that reaching out further into their allies and contacts to get weapons. And one was this deal with Turkey that they had, Turkey denies any official negotiation, but it would have brought weapons from Turkey to the Wagner Group, who then would be able to bring it to Russia, Russia's war effort. Anyway, I find that really fascinating that you have this mercenary group that has so much influence globally, kind of beyond what we attribute to Russia as a nation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the fact that they're an independent operator, obviously they've expressed openly frustration about getting adequate supplies, particularly of artillery, from the Russian government. Mm-hmm. So seeing them use their own kind of supply chain and resources as a non-state entity to try to bring in kind of their ammunition. Again, Bakhmut has staked the future political reputation of the group on this battle, and it hasn't gone well at all. So I think there's a high level of frustration within it. So seeing them kind of go to these extraordinary means to source weapons and equipment.
Well, and one thing when you say like he's been recently vocal about wanting to end the war and lock in, the current Russian gains. I mean, he's probably the only one in Russia who can say those things without worrying that he's going to trip over a balcony because of this independent power he has from them being so influential globally.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, just that because they have such a big operational footprint and other areas strategically important to Russia, beyond probably their, even given how bad Bakhmut has gone, they probably are some of the more effective fighting forces that Russia deploys. And is the only reason they are making any gains whatsoever, despite essentially throwing in new recruits into a meat grinder. But yeah, I thought it was really interesting seeing him come out publicly on Telegram, essentially providing bullet points for Putin to easily frame this domestically as a great victory for the Russian people, and that, all the points were, well, we've essentially killed enough of the Ukrainian military and denazified these areas, and we've gained this massive amount of territory and freed Russian-speaking citizens that, easily, if Putin were to try to pivot and embrace kind of the Chinese plan, there's certainly a way for him to domestically frame it to end the conflict in a way that, he would be in a position of, I mean, the polling is still very high, for the support for the war. So I could see ending it and then, declaring this victory and celebration, certainly guarantees his power for the foreseeable time, but doesn't seem like
that would be rational.
He wants to move through that direction, right?
I have a lot of questions that Putin is rational in the sense that we talk about rational actors. I mean, the other really interesting thing that I said is the way that they almost had to deal with Turkey, a NATO member, right? So the idea, this danger that because they have all these ties to all these different countries that you could have had, or you might still have a NATO country end up indirectly supplying weapons to Russia.
Yeah, it kind of points to that unique position that Turkey's in and has sought to play.
Yeah.
But yeah, so beyond that, the hopes have continued to rest on the outcome of the expected Ukrainian counteroffensive. But I think the expectations are becoming increasingly muted. And that's been somewhat evident with the intelligence leaks and the reports from that time period. And I think there's already been reports coming out that it has been delayed from its original date just based on delays in equipment delivery, ammunition shortage, and the continuous complaint on the lack of Western aircraft and long-range missiles, which are really necessary for them to target military targets deep in either Ukrainian territory or even within Russia itself. In the meantime, the one success the Russians have had is immobilizing troops that have done the basic hand grunt work of reinforcing defenses. So they're quite an extensive trench network at this point around Crimea, around the supply lines within the south. So it's definitely made it more difficult. So the most likely element of even following the potential counteroffensive is, one, it's unlikely to accomplish its objectives that Zelensky's kind of laid out of seizing all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, and is most likely to result then in a stalemate. So I think you've seen some real interesting pieces come out within the last week. And I know you read the foreign policy article by Richard Haas and Charles Kupchan. So did you want to summarize that?
Sure. I think basically it reflects an argument that has been emerging over several months, but is gaining some popularity. And it's this idea that the war is likely to come to a stalemate between both sides. And it's untenable for the US and the Western allies to continue the same degree of support because of their own dwindling resources. So already there's been more than 100,000 casualties, Ukrainian GDP shrinking by 30%, 8 million refugees, plus many more millions internally displaced. So basically they're saying that the US and Western allies have to consider all of their interests, right? So they need, particularly the US, needs to be preparing for the potential war in Asia and making sure that it has the supplies for that. So what is the West's real interest? Do they want to continue to maintain this stalemate that will cost many more lives and further hurt the economy? Or do they try to become more realistic about and have some limits about how much support they supply? And the idea is to wait through this Ukrainian offensive, hope that it goes well, but not expecting much out of it. And this idea that if we were to have a ceasefire right now and Russia getting like more of the Donbass and keeping Crimea and stuff, that the West could still say it's this heroic victory over Russia who wasn't able to just come in and crush Ukraine. My big problem with this, it assumes that in a stalemate, both sides would be willing to come to the table to negotiate. And it particularly assumes that the West can somehow get Russia to the table and even agree to the ceasefire. I think that's not possible. I think this conversation is misplaced. I think we need to figure out what we do in light of the fact that Putin has maximalist gains, and he does not seem to show any sign of wanting to wind down the war. Maybe as a stalemate goes on, we'll see a different attitude from Russia. But I think that's really one of the big sticking points in a lot of this conversation then is not very productive.
Yeah, I think I agree to the extent that Putin certainly still has maximalist gains. I think he's also banking a lot on political winds changing within the West and for the unity, particularly that the U.S. has displayed, will change with the 2024 election. So a stalemate is something that he's just able to maintain a lot easier. And people point out, Russia has a much bigger population. Their economy is much bigger. They've done an extraordinary job of weathering these sanctions. The global South, increasingly, the opinion is going in their favor. So everything kind of favors being able to just outlast the West and let democracy run its course, for people to get frustrated and for them to back out. So the only way to kind of break that is to make, the cost high enough. That's why it seems like so much is riding on how successful can the counteroffensive be in pressuring Russia to the extent where it makes sense to lock in gains. So they have more to gain by locking in what they have, declaring victory domestically, as opposed to further escalation and potential loss of regime.
One thing that I forgot to mention that I do think is important and is not necessarily been part of the larger conversation around Washington about this article, but that the fact that they do argue for this offensive, that the U.S. and Western allies provide much more, in a quicker manner, more of these weapons now instead of this kind of trickle out effect. Yeah. And I'm increasingly agreeing with that because it seems difficult how we keep slowly wrenching up what we will send to Ukraine. And it seems much more or less effective to do it in that manner.
Yeah, and I think this is something, Alexander Vindman, and we talked about his last article probably 3 months ago, was very much to this effect. In order to be credible at the negotiation table with Russia, you have to have the armaments, the long-range armaments, being both aircraft and long-range missiles to threaten Crimea, to threaten the bridge going across the strait. That's the only way to really bring this war to a negotiated end, is to be able to credibly threaten complete and total loss. And the only way to do that is through this surge of equipment. So it does seem like the US and Europe has made, potentially a fatal strategic error in not rushing, because all of this equipment is going to take a lot of training too. Just like the tanks, we drug our feet for a very long time. They're beginning to be deployed, but they're not going to be used in this coming offensive in the next month or two. Same's going to be because we never gave them F-16s. We never provided the long-range missiles. They're not going to be effectively deployed, for this offensive. Now, is it too late? Should they make the push? I mean, that's what essentially Haas and Kupchan are saying. It's not too late. We should make a surge now, but we need to stop being worried about escalation, about the nuclear threat. And we just need to do this because this is the only way to get the best outcome for Ukraine at this point.
Yeah, I'm slowly converting to that argument. I think a lot when Vindman spoke, I thought we need to be cautious about escalation. And I do think a slow trickle of increase has reduced the chances of escalation just because it's this, you're slowly wrenching it up. It's like the frog boiling water almost. You're slowly raising that temperature of the weapons, but it's not all at once. And so Russia's kind of less reactive to it where they might have been before. But at the same time, this seems like not a very effective way to deploy resources. But I also think that this reaction, you may still not get this reaction from Russia where they're like, oh, we feel threatened and we're going to go to the negotiating table, because I think they still may think that they can wait this out, that even with this equipment and stuff, it'd just be very hard to truly push them back completely out of Ukraine.
Yeah, and I think this is where, and maybe if what you're saying, that Putin's not a rational actor, this part won't make sense. But this entire thing, Lula's pushing it. Obviously, China's pushing it. Within the Haas article, there was this idea of a negotiated solution where each side kind of has a group of countries that are part of it. And this idea of reviving the BRICS, that the leaders of India, China, and Brazil could put enough pressure on Russia to encourage Putin, to lock in these gains and get the solution. Do you see that as viable? Or is Putin capable of being influenced by his closest ideological and economic partners?
Not at present. I think the reaction that I saw on Twitter among the experts, particularly the Indian experts, was there's no way will India work with Russia, even though they may have these separate relationships with Russia, that no way would they work with China. You just won't see that coordination.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I know I said it wrong the first time, but India and China are not going to work together at all. So India feels very strong in its enmity towards China. And I think that really hurts this idea, even though you could see they both have certain interests in working with Russia on this and the BRICS more generally. Lulu, of course, he's the one who invented the BRICS. So he's always trying to get a more global role. But when you said that, it's kind of interesting because if you ever got to the point of negotiations, there might be something to that a little bit. It sort of reminds me of the Korean Peninsula and how you had a group of countries on each side taking responsibility or managing it and kind of helping to preserve this ceasefire initially.
Yeah, and within the article, they draw that exact parallel to both the DMZ and Korea and Cyprus as a potential long-term solution for a negotiated peace, where even though essentially to get Ukraine on board, because we haven't talked about that, you're leaving the final settlement of Donbass and Crimea open. It's not like we're handing this territory to Russia, but it's the acknowledgement that as long as Putin's in power, that essentially is going to be in Russian hands.
Yeah. I think these articles are really targeted to Ukraine, need to put pressure to get Ukraine to the negotiating table. But as long as Russia is not willing to go there, I don't think the problem is Ukraine.
Yeah. Yeah, I just feel like Russia can get there with the right incentive, and having people with significant influence like Prigozhin putting the right pressure points on the Kremlin, that eventually it gets through to Putin that this is a solution where he can domestically claim victory, have sanctions wind down, maintain power, all of that, that eventually that kind of rational approach will seem appealing. But I think it has to come with the real threat of total loss. And that only comes through what everybody's arguing, that you got to supply Ukraine with the ability to deliver total loss to Russia.
Yeah. And I just don't know. I mean, they're still limited by the military that they're using, the personnel and such. I just don't think the war still has 70% popularity. Putin's in no danger of losing power right now. I don't see his personal incentives to come to the negotiating table.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's the sticking point in the end. I know you're right. All the articles are really focused on Zelensky, and they have similar polls in the Ukraine, and giving up territorial is like single digits for the Ukrainian people of any sort. I mean, they're in no mood. There's no political will to have a negotiated solution giving up territory, and certainly not before the outcome of the counteroffensive. But with the Ukraine, you see a lot of rational reasons to bring them to the table. This whole EU membership, of having a security pact, all these things kind of make sense in a democratic government, that the Ukrainian people and Zelensky could eventually get on board with a negotiated solution. But yeah, if Putin, despite people kind of internally pushing for it, if he's just steadfast and seeing that window of weakness that he can just grind it out, they have enough bodies, that's what they're willing to sacrifice to get. But yeah, he would still have to hold on to maximalist gains. Is that what the thought process is?
Yeah. So, I mean, here's the thing. The West is helping providing the weapons for Ukraine to use against Russia. So they have a lot of leverage. All they have to go to Zelensky and be like, we're not going to continue to provide all this equipment, so you need to go to the negotiating table. They have leverage. But no one has leverage over Russia.
Well, that's not true. I mean, China has leverage over Russia.
Does it? Enough to make it go to the negotiating table? No.
Maybe.
No, I don't. I mean,
you
how?
don't think so?
No, I absolutely do not think so. No. I don't think there's a point of leverage there.
Yeah, it's not a rational thought at all at this point for him to still have, I'm going to overthrow the Ukrainian regime if I can wait long enough. I mean, what if the 2024 election, Biden's reelected? Does he then see, okay, there's no political window? That's the only thing I could see it hinging on, is the withdrawal of U.S. support, like the complete withdrawal of U.S. support, which is only foreseeable if Trump is reelected to office. That's the only political, even if like DeSantis is elected, I don't see him taking the same policies of aggressively against NATO as the Trump administration. That's the only thing I could see him holding on to, because the U.S. is honestly the linchpin for Ukrainian support, right?
Definitely. Well, I mean, look at it. Like, we can't indefinitely send ammunition to Ukraine. We are drawing down on our own stockpile.
Yeah, but we're also ramping up production capacity, which we need to do anyway for China.
But we haven't done it.
This is a wake-up call.
I know. I'm surprised that we haven't. I mean, I haven't read any articles that have done that in the immediate term. I've read articles that say that
we're definitely ramping up like artillery production. I mean, the capacity's increasing. Now, how permanent, or if this is then on a longer basis, I mean, I hope this is happening. If we're going to, if we're really prepared to go to war with China, We have to increase capacity across.
I mean, you may have read articles that say that. I haven't seen anything that says we...
I've definitely seen we've ramped up specifically for the shells that are being used in Ukraine. The monthly and yearly annual production is increasing, yeah.
That's good. Because, I mean, just about a month or so ago, articles came out about how they need, we're sending this amount of ammunition, which is like twice as much that we're actually making in that same time.
Yeah, they're still burning through faster than even what we're currently ramping up to.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're Putin, you see that, well, that can't go on indefinitely.
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much focus. I don't feel like he's banking on industrial capacity or the ability. I think it's the loss of political will.
Well, the combination, right? I mean, you're going to have people use that argument. They're already using that argument. I mean, he can read this Haas article and hear similar positions in Washington and say, look, they are saying that we can't do this indefinitely. And, that just means I have to wait it out.
Yeah, but I think it's tied strictly to political, just because there is that split within the Republican Party. The ones that recognize wisely that this is the most cost-effective defensive investment that the United States has ever made to be able to deplete and destroy an adversary's military, versus the isolationist, essentially pro-authoritarian wing of the Republican Party that's pro-Putin. And the only side I really see from a foreign policy getting implemented would be in a new, vengeful Trump administration coming in. And if he's banking on that, I don't think that's a good bet for him.
So we hope not. I don't know. I just see that Ukraine's not the problem right now in getting to the negotiating table, and that, sure, these articles point out the West has leverage. The West, for a long time, the argument was, do we have the right to force Ukraine to surrender or not?
Yeah.
But the point is, we have leverage. If that's what we wanted to do,
we're the lifeline for Ukraine. Yep.
But no one has that leverage on Russia. And so until Russia shows, which by staying as far away as they can from the Chinese proposal just tells me they're not anywhere near thinking about it.
That's true. Yep. No, good perspective.
Okay. So Washington and much of the world was all a flurry about Macron's visit to China last week in the Politico interview, where he made many comments that certainly alienated Washington's response by saying that Taiwan is not our problem, and so we don't want to, we're not going to just follow the United States on this, that we want to have strategic autonomy in Europe. Again, that we're not just going to go with whatever the U.S. says. This isn't just a West versus China thing, and that France and Europe wants to carve out their own place. He adopted the term multipolar, which people have pointed to that this is part of the Chinese lexicon, but this is also part of the Euro lexicon. So, I mean, one really valuable course that I took when I was at the University of Amsterdam was about EU politics. And since the EU has been formed, this idea that they could have a separate foreign policy completely from the United States and have that autonomy has been at, the core of what everything that I've learned about the European Union. So these aren't new terms, but it comes at a time when it comes at a very not good time. And one of the things that people have pointed out, you have the U.S. footing, all the military equipment for the Ukrainian war. And why would the U.S. should they support Europe's problems if Europe is not going to support them on Taiwan? What is your reaction to all of this?
Well, I mean, I'm a little befuddled where Macron is coming from, because in general, I respected his leadership. I think he's had a very difficult thing to manage. And maybe a lot of this goes back to French domestic politics. But he came into a France that was lagging behind for decades in terms of productivity, especially relative to the German economy. So there are enormous reforms to undertake. And what politically he's done is brave and extremely unpopular. Obviously, France has been in absolute chaos in terms of the amount of riots.
Pension reform. Is that
right?
What you mean
Yeah. So I'm just saying, again, I think with most things, you got to look domestically. So from that perspective, I always respected Macron's done, made unpopular decisions for the long-term prosperity of the French country in a more globally competitive world. Now, foreign policy-wise, I mean, his most prominent thing before then was the reaching out to Putin and his conversations. And before I thought that, well, that's not a bad thing to have. It's not a bad thing to have, given what's going on, to have kind of these very high-level conversations and touch points. But this one just completely caught me off guard, because in my mind, I saw the Germans as much more pro-China, just because a huge amount of business in luxury goods and luxury automobiles and aircraft and whatnot, that the Germans had a much higher economic stake within China. So I would expect this from Scholz or a German leader rather than Macron. But then the visuals and the language and just the betrayal of core liberal values, which France prides itself on as the founder of liberalism, that it throws this all under the bus, throws Taiwan under the bus, has these comments about Taiwan while China is conducting aggressive military. Right before China is conducting aggressive military exercises threatening Taiwan. Is just like mind-blowing. So yeah, it's no surprise that by the time he landed in France, I mean, there was absolute shitstorm for him waiting on the policy front. So now he's basically hated domestically and by many of the allies. I mean, it seems like such a clueless timing, management of the optics. It's political malpractice if nothing else. I mean, I don't get it.
Political malpractice.
This is political malpractice, absolutely. And nobody would tell him that the optics of this are horrible. Yeah, so it's crazy. It's a big diplomatic victory for Xi. The visuals, the conversation, it just agreeing to all of the talking points around the multipolar world about, we don't want this to be a Cold War mentality. And even throwing the US dollar under the bus.
That's what I was
like, wow.
I think that was
Macron
the thing that
looks like
me.
The biggest tool ever. And I'm disappointed, because otherwise I respected his leadership. I think he's done a lot of good but very painful things for French competitiveness. But this is a huge, huge debacle.
Yeah, I mean, this is his ego getting in the way. And I said, he wants to set himself up as this statesman. But to make those comments, he had to give up on this idea that there is value to the Western liberal order. In fact, saying that a new international rules-based system needs to come into being. So it was pretty extraordinarily. It reminds me, and it kind of fuels people like this, of a talk at NDU this year where one of the speakers, my very least favorite speaker, was like, if Europe doesn't join us on China, then they're no longer our allies. A ridiculous thing to say. But it certainly fuels people like him when they act.
Yeah.
When people like that in Europe act like they are going to have this independent policy towards China. The thing that I think that gets missed in this outrage is that ultimately the actions of Europe are very consistent with the US, because ultimately they have the same basic interest. So one thing I thought was interesting, The Economist points out that during this exercise that China conducted in Taiwan, France, with bases in the Indo-Pacific, contributes more militarily to such efforts than any other European power. This weekend, amid China's drills, it sailed a frigate through the Taiwan Strait. So, I mean, they're participating in exercises to protect Taiwan. They have no interest in changing the status quo, which, of course, is what they corrected when he came home. To the extent that there's any divergence is on trade, where both Germany and France have focused on creating more business deals. They have denounced decoupling, which is not surprising. And I think, I don't know the realism of decoupling to begin with. I think, though, you are seeing U.S. companies put further investment into China. And there's a lot of also just very plain supply chain reasons and things of that nature. And if the U.S. were to leave, if enough companies left, then I do think European companies would try to fill that void, and there's a real competitiveness issue. But that depends on companies acting against their own economic interests. So somehow the incentives from the U.S. would have to make where they have these incentives to leave China. and cede that competitiveness. But here's, even on economics, this was a great quote, I thought, in the foreign policy, which was Europeans are concerned with many aspects of China's behavior, from unfair trade practices to human rights abuses. The European Commission has been willing to confront some of these issues and even labeling China a systemic rival, promoting alternative models of governance. Now, you didn't see anything like that in what Macron, but I think this really reflects the underlying strategic interests. I do think what Europeans are most worried about is this kind of confrontational language that is developed between China and the United States. And I'm very concerned by this language as well. So I don't blame Europeans. And I think if Europe did have a role in ratcheting down these tensions in this language, then that would actually be a good thing. But what Macron did was the opposite of that.
Yeah, he allowed himself to be a political prop for Xi. And what was really interesting is Macron was actually accompanied by the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, and she actually delivered a pretty strident and tough tone with China. But she essentially, because China doesn't like to deal with supranational organization, well, maybe except the UN where it has control, it kind of sidelined her. She was only had about an hour out of the 6 hours that she and Macron directly met. So it was kind of interesting. The one that is coming in and kind of expressing the actual position that most EU nations, including France, has taken in reality. And she was willing to express verbally, face-to-face, that she was kind of sidelined during all of this. But she was brought on the trip. I think Macron actually insisted that happened. But then in terms of the visuals and the political prop, Macron really just stepped right into it.
Yeah. I think this is another case of France wanting to speak for Europe. Germany and France have a competition of which one of them gets to speak for Europe. And that has always been the case. So, there's that, Macron trying to speak for Europe when he clearly does not. But I thought the reactions this week and what I was reading sort of around Washington was that there was people being concerned about Europe taking this autonomous position. And I don't understand where that's coming from because I don't see that actually happening in reality. And I think that the reaction in his own country and in Europe itself also belies that Macron was sticking his neck out and doing it in a way where he had just made a fool of himself.
Right.
Not that he actually represents some strategic shift.
Policy change. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah, I don't know what got into it. But yeah, of course, France does have that history. Under de Gaulle, it was this third way. And even as recent as the Iraq War, and this was kind of the height of kind of European or EU supremacy as a third of the multipolar world. But you really haven't seen that sort of talk bubble up, even with France. I don't know if it's the fact that with the retirement of Merkel, who really was seen as the head and the most powerful leader within the EU, that Macron, with the Ukraine war, has seen kind of this window of opportunity to continue, like you said, that rivalry between France and Germany for leadership of the EU. And yeah, to your point, he's sticking his neck out there to really kind of stake a case and instead just really stepped in it.
I think he's a big ego.
Yeah. Clear. He's known to have a very big ego.
And that explains a lot. But I think on Taiwan, the one thing that is relevant is that did it do damage to the West seeming unified on Taiwan? And, one of the big worries is that China might try to invade Taiwan because it doesn't believe that the U.S. or other countries would actually defend Taiwan. And I think the U.S. has made it very clear that they would. I don't think we would need European support for that, but obviously you would want Europe to at least be unified in what they say. I actually think that, you saw Europe so reluctantly go along with Iraq, but they went along with it. That there's no way they're not going along with Taiwan because, again, they have the same interest. If China was to destroy Taiwanese democracy, they're reliant on Taiwan for semiconductor chips, just like everybody else is. The underlying interests are exactly the same.
I don't think there's really any gap there. Yeah, I think, Macron was really just kind of off on his own. That's why this is political malpractice, 100%.
Egos will do that to you. So as we kind of mentioned in the very beginning, that wasn't the only notable meeting. So Brazil's president, Lulu, also met with Xi this week. China is Brazil's number one trading partner since 2009, with a focus mostly on commodity exports. Basically, Brazil has a huge agricultural exporting country, and China imports much of its food, and so does a lot with Brazil. And this kind of explains why China is Brazil's number one trading partner, because the U.S. doesn't import a lot of food because it has its own agricultural industry that competes with developing countries like Brazil. But the U.S. has far greater investment in Brazil, valued at $125 billion versus China's $29 billion. Although I know this isn't the first meeting between Xi and Brazil's presidents. I can't remember if they're officially a member of the Belt and Road, or they have had talks about that to increase China's investment. There's been a lot of talk about building that the Chinese have built dams in Brazil that have been necessary and created electricity and other business opportunities. So I think China's investment in Brazil is definitely growing, and we can't rest too easily and just say, well, the U.S. investment is far higher than China.
I definitely agree. And I think the only reason this probably got more attention than it would otherwise is because of the proximity to Macron's visit.
I
so it just seemed like,
so.
Two definitely within, the moderate and left to center within the U.S. After getting rid of Bolsonaro, there was this idea. It's like, oh yeah, Brazil's back in kind of U.S. camp, somebody that will support kind of our policies, forgetting that Brazil's natural position, certainly his first presidency, he's part of the global South. They've taken historically a very much kind of a non-aligned position in the movement. But Lula, as you mentioned earlier, is critical in this idea around BRICS, which otherwise
he started it. He started
which otherwise wouldn't have any of this relationship. But the idea that Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, kind of have this unique, as growing, emerging, developing economies, a unique say within the world. So he's definitely kind of putting himself out there. He's taken very ambitious foreign policy perspective. So I think this is just kind of part of that. And obviously she's been on a huge diplomatic push since opening with COVID. So I think it's just notable seeing them two again. But to your point, Biden met with Lula earlier. So in February, Lula came to the White House, and I think they bonded, according to the Economist article, around their experiences with insurrections. But in terms of actual material economic investment, very little came out of that. Mm-hmm. In fact, the U.S. was pretty chintzy in donating to a rainforest protection fund, I think of only, what was it, 50 million?
Yeah.
50 million, which is like...
Germany just contributed 4
times.
Change
you get out of the U.S. sofa, pretty much. And Germany, donated like 4 times more. While China is coming with, like the Belt and Road Initiative with real projects, delivering real infrastructure.
Yes.
Obviously, U.S. private sector has invested heavily within Brazil, but
not
again, the U.S.
anymore.
Government, maybe not to the extent anymore. And probably a lot of this was oil and gas related to some extent. But they're not really coming to the table with these meaningful deals, which we've talked about before in terms of that relationship with the global South.
But it does bring up again, I think, this discussion about these non-aligned countries on the Russia-Ukraine war. And I thought it was interesting, the business ties that Brazil maintains with Russia, and a lot of it is around fertilizer. It is Russia's biggest customer for fertilizer. In Brazil, 25% of its fertilizer comes from Russia. So it maintains its business ties with Russia, even though it has formally condemned its actions. Although in this meeting, he did not use the words war or invasion in trying to say, like, hey, these countries, we can be these neutral arbiters, in any sort of diplomatic agreement between Russia and Ukraine. But I just thought it was interesting, again, here's another large country that does have some influence, and it has maintained all of its business ties to Russia, and how complicated that ends up being when we think about the war and condemning Russia, or how so much of the world and in its actions just doesn't participate in that idea that we need to isolate Russia in some way or punish Russia.
Yeah, that it has kind of these, strategic strangleholds on the economy of these areas. I mean, with India, it's kind of the military ties. Yeah, fascinating that fertilizer, that much comes from Russia, because it's not like potash, the main ingredient for fertilizers, is that rare. So I don't know if it must be the economies of it, similar to solar panel production or lithium batteries or things like that, where maybe it's just the lax environmental regulations in Russia that make it such a huge source for producing fertilizer and things like that.
I think what's interesting is that Russia is not this big economy like China does, right?
Yeah, not at all.
So the fact that based on different types of ties, and this being a kind of limited economic, but in a very important economic, since Brazil is one of its main exports is agriculture.
Yeah.
So it makes up a huge part of the economy. But in itself, if you looked at the numbers, I'm sure the numbers are not very significant margins, at all.
Yeah,
and so as someone who studies economic ties and conflict, I find it interesting. And I think sometimes that I really struggle to figure out how you grasp in numbers the kind of these ties that aren't large in numbers, but have these really powerful effects.
Yeah, there's got to be like some multiplier. Like, this input is so critical to this country's economy, even though the numbers of it don't seem that big, but the input itself unlocks this much agricultural production within Brazil. And that's worth X amount. I don't know, but anyway. Yeah, it wouldn't show up in the numbers.
Yeah. Anyway, I find that kind of interesting. And I think it goes into countries making very pragmatic decisions. And ultimately, when we're talking about, the influence of China in some countries wanting to cozy up on China, it's for very pragmatic reasons. And why they are not making, join with the West against Russia and stuff. Again, it's based on their own very pragmatic economic,
they're not approaching this from
an
ideological point of view. I mean, this is strictly their national interest.
And again, I think the U.S. in all these cases should be wary in trying to push this ideological narrative, because it doesn't have any traction with China. And I think we rely on that so much. And I was thinking, because The Economist had an article this week again about the 100 countries that, like Brazil, are essentially non-aligned on the war movement. And I was just thinking, the U.S. thinks it can frame this war about the war between Western values or the West versus China, and that countries, might have to choose between the two. But you see from even Europe is not willing to be part of that, as well as you think about these other 100 countries. They're not going to choose. And if you force them to choose. So this sort of idea that America has, and I think, America, we should be more humble about what influence we do have. And we seem to think that, again, in that statement, well, if Europe doesn't go along with us exactly lockstep on China, then they're no longer our allies. But by that definition, the U.S. would have no allies. And then what kind of influence, a country needs allies to have power. So,
yeah, no, I think it's foolish. It seems like an improper fit for the same Cold War ideology. And in looking back at the Cold War, I think everybody acknowledges the things that we did very badly in managing that Cold War. But at least there was a real ideological divide, or a clear driver between kind of the two systems. And here it's much murkier. When you have a authoritarian state capitalist society that is so intertwined with the global economic system, I will give a shout out, even though we do make fun of Tom Friedman. I thought he had a very good article in the New York Times that did, he's good about taking that big step back and framing kind of what this US and China competition was about. So it's definitely worth checking out that article. But yeah, it is about the complexities of that. And this isn't the Soviet Union. This isn't the Cold War. You can't really frame it. You could argue that wasn't very effective, how we divided the world into two camps, and it resulted in millions of unnecessary deaths around the world and governments overthrown. So we need to manage it in a much smarter way than we did with the original Cold War.
Yeah, so I wish we would think more about that instead of have our politicians on both sides of the aisle just scream and see who can sound the harshest on China. Well, I think that wraps that up. And just going into my interview with Bates Gill, which I found was a really interesting interview I apologize in advance for the sound quality issues. He was having construction going on at his place. And so there wasn't any way to kind of edit that sound out, unfortunately. So it might be a little bit distracting. But I hope you will listen to it because I think the things we talked about were really interesting. And to begin with, we talked about China's military modernization. And that's just something we haven't covered on this show and something that I haven't had a chance to talk about. And I think is something that will be of interest to a lot of people. So I hope you listen and enjoy. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, and I'm here with Bates Gill, the Executive Director of the Center for China Analysis with the Asia Society Policy Institute and a Senior Associate Fellow with the Royal United Services Institute. His most recent book is Daring to Struggle, China's Global Ambitions Under Xi Jinping, and I highly recommend that you check it out. Hi, Bates. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Anita. It's great to be with you. Thanks so much.
We're so happy that you're here. So just to start out with it, many in the military community here and outside of it are concerned that China's military modernization is part of a more confrontational posture that includes taking Taiwan through military force. What do you think of this assessment?
Well, it's certainly the case that over the past 10 or 15 years, and particularly under Xi Jinping's leadership, the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, has made some considerable strides forward, both in terms of quantity and quality of its armed forces. So that's included, significant expansion and modernization of certain elements of its armed forces, particularly in the realm of power projections, so sort of in missilery, naval forces, and aircraft. But also importantly, maybe more importantly, made some significant strides forward in terms of how it organizes itself. Under Xi Jinping in 2015, 2016 was launched a major reform and reorganization effort, which was probably one of the biggest bureaucratic and organizational changes the PLA had experienced in its history, or at least since the 1950s, in which there was an attempt to try to create the organizational conditions whereby the PLA could be a more effective joint warfighting force. One of the historical and I think still continuing and persistent challenges the PLA has faced is a kind of stovepiping where the different service arms, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, were not good at operating with one another in a joint way. And this reorganization is an effort to try and change that, first by introducing joint commands, joint regional commands or theater commands, under which the PLA would be geographically organized in China, but also to introduce a new service arm to the PLA called the Strategic Support Force, which ostensibly is intended to provide a sort of underlying information and technology backbone or foundation, which would service all of the principal warfighting arms of the PLA, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Rocket Force, to help them integrate with one another better, to take greater advantage of new technologies that the PLA has been able to access, like space-based and cyber-based, and so on. So, a long story short, the PLA is definitely positioning itself to be a far more effective and powerful military player, especially in the region in its immediate periphery. And of course, that brings us to the question of Taiwan. I do think that one of the driving forces behind this advancement in its qualitative, technological capability, plus its quantitative organizational effectiveness, is very much the understanding that they need to be able to be prepared to use force if necessary in order to achieve what they would call the reunification of Taiwan. Xi Jinping is pretty clear by saying things like, we need to be ready to do so, and not that we will do so, but that we need to be ready to do so by 2027, which is sort of the 100th anniversary of the formation of the People's Liberation Army. And more vaguely, but I think in some ways more tellingly, that Taiwan the retaking of Taiwan is explicitly noted as being a goal in order to achieve the so-called great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which according to Xi's timeline, needs to take place by 2049. So you add it all together, and yes, we should be having mounting concerns about China's capacity as well as its apparent will to potentially use force going forward in its region and in particular towards Taiwan in the future.
Yeah, that's really insightful. Continuing along these lines, you wrote recently about the rise of the military industrial technocrats as an important new faction at the top of China's political system. What does this mean for the growing rivalry between the US and China? And are there additional foreign policy implications for this development?
Well, thanks for noting that article that we had appear recently. I want to give full credit to my colleague, Wu Guoguang, who is based at Stanford University, but who is also a senior fellow with the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society Policy Institute, who did the lion's share of that work. Very, very interesting research looking at the backgrounds and professional experiences of certain members of the recently elected Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party, the Politburo being the 24 or 25 member body, which is really the second highest, most powerful deliberation and decision-making body within the Chinese Communist Party, and from which are selected 7 men. It's almost always men. The 7 men who make up the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the group that Xi Jinping is at the top of. So it's an important group, the Politburo, and examining who's up, who's down, and who are the newcomers, especially, is always an important analytical exercise that China watchers need to take, because it probably helps us to the degree we can discern the black box of Chinese senior elite decision making. It's one way for us to have some idea of the directions and priorities which the leadership is giving to certain policy areas and so on. So one of the most interesting outcomes that Guoguang identified in the most recent Politburo selection process is that something like 40% of the new members, the newly elected members of the Politburo, and what we're talking about is about 5 out of the 13 new members of this 24-member body, all had an unusually similar set of educational background and professional experience. Namely, they all have educational backgrounds in military technical sciences. So things like aerospace, nuclear engineering, artillery-related educational experience, armaments. And in addition to that educational background, went into the military-industrial complex, first as engineers, but then rising through the ranks to take on increasingly larger and larger managerial roles, some of them even ending up being the top leaders of these massive state-owned military-industrial firms in China. And then from there, being plucked, from that professional background to then take up political roles. So moving into the local and provincial party political system and rising through those ranks, some of them reaching levels of provincial governor or levels of provincial party secretary, and then moving from there up to this, this very, very senior level of Chinese elite politics. So very, very interesting. And Guoguang also identified a continuing pipeline in this regard. That is, we see more of these individuals moving up through the ranks of the military-industrial complex, taking local political positions. And so we argued, we're going to be seeing more of these sorts of people at the upper reaches of Chinese power. So the question is why? What's going on here? And yeah, I think, the intensifying rivalry with the United States probably has something to do with it. We talked earlier about the need for the PLA to be better prepared to fight if necessary, and more likely than not, or at least this is the assumption the Chinese have to make, if there is going to be conflict across the Taiwan Strait, there's a very, very high likelihood that the United States is going to be involved in some way. And so the PLA needs to be prepared to fight technologically sophisticated and highly experienced military, maybe the thinking is, we need more people at the top of our decision-making structures who can drive military industrial innovation, who can drive civil military integration, which is a priority for the overall Chinese military industrial system, and who sort of knows their way around these questions. How do you motivate the Chinese military industrial system to move in this direction? What sort of weaponry and technologies ought to be prioritized as part of these choices? And maybe more broadly, how do you mobilize the overall party and government decision-making structures in order to prioritize and flow resources towards those end goals? So we can't know for sure that that's why this unusual cadre of individuals seems to have gained some greater influence in the Politburo. But I think those are probably some plausible explanations.
Yeah, that's great. And as you were talking, I was thinking that article also referenced the Chinese spy balloon over the United States. And there's been a lot of discussion over whether that was just a separate program that was not from the PLA, that was not necessarily coordinated, or why it would be the timing of it. And kind of in the construct that you're talking about, how do you think a program like that fits in? Does it have something to do with the increased influence of the PLA, or part of the problem previously not having enough integration into the main leadership? I'm just wondering what you think of that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Anita. And obviously the election of those individuals to the Politburo back in October, November, and then the subsequent balloon incident, I don't think are related.
Right.
Obviously, they happened in too close of sequence for us to believe that there was some sort of causation. But I think both the election of these individuals and the balloon incident help us understand a persistent set of problems within China in terms of what we would call in our nomenclature, civil military relations. I think that's not quite the right term in the Chinese case. It's really party military relations, because let's not forget, just as context for everyone listening, the People's Liberation Army is not a army in the sense that we consider our military in the United States to be a national military. It's the party army. It is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party, and it is under the direction and leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. This harkens back, obviously, to Mao Zedong's famous statement that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. And that's been true for the entire history of the People's Liberation Army since its founding back in 1927. But that said, while that is ostensibly the case, and it is typically true that the political leadership of the party retains control, there have been many, many instances where that control has been fractured, fragmented, less than optimum for the party leadership. And the example of the balloon incident may be just one relatively minor, but still consequential episode of that. First of all, the PLA is an enormous organization. It's true even in the American and other government contexts that there's no way the top leader is going to know everything that's going on. It's just not possible. And in some cases, for example, in terms of covert operations, there's an incentive of the organizations conducting those to make sure the leader doesn't know. In other words, in case there's a necessity for plausible deniability, right? Mm-hmm. So, those sorts of dynamics would certainly be operating in the case of the PLA and its relationship with the party. And I think that's what we saw in the case of the balloon incident. A botched mission, a sort of a failure occurred, problem arose that led to the balloon going off course, conducting in a trajectory that I don't believe was intended, that they were unable to reverse. So I suspect that Xi Jinping would not have been aware of that specific mission. Had he known, obviously, what ultimately happened, if he'd known what ultimately happened beforehand, and he would have surely understood that would have made the Blinken visit very difficult to undertake. And the Chinese system had previously sent every signal to the U.S. side that they welcomed Blinken's visit and that he was even going to be received by Xi Jinping. So I find it hard to believe that the outcome was intentional on the Chinese part. The mission was obviously undertaken for a purpose, but I don't think the purpose was what it ended up becoming. So it's just another example, and there are many that we don't have to go into here, but there are many of where sometimes the left hand just doesn't know what the right hand's doing. Mm-hmm. And that maybe the appointment of some of these individuals to the Politburo, the retention, there are other examples of appointments, the retention of one of the vice chairmen of the Central Military Commission, which is the party organization that oversees the PLA and which Xi Jinping heads. One of his vice chairmen was granted an extension of his tenure, even though he was well past the typical retirement age. All this adds up to me as an indications that Xi still is having a bit of trouble being fully confident over his control and ability to supervise and oversee what he wants the PLA to do.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. Shifting to the economy, Xi in recent years has expanded the role of the CCP, the party, in the economy. This has come in the form of crackdowns in the tech sector, demanding a greater role for the Communist Party in corporate governance of private enterprises, and most recently, allowing the party's top leaders to assert more direct control over financial policy and bank regulation. Why does Xi feel an expanded role for the CCP in the economy is necessary? And how does it factor into his domestic and international goals?
Well, thanks, Anita. That's just a great set of questions. And I think it's one that we really all need to be focusing on. And I know a lot of people are trying to unpack this because for me, the answers to them will have a more fundamental impact on China's future and the kind of China that we on the outside will be dealing with over the next 10 or 15 years. It has a more fundamental impact on those questions, even than perhaps, I would say the more narrow question, even the more dangerous one of the potential of Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Why? Because these strategic economic choices are going to have enormous bearing on whether China is able to deal with these looming and increasingly challenging structural economic problems that they will be facing in the coming years. What do I mean? Well, things like trying to increase greater productivity within the Chinese economy. There's been diminishing productivity over time. Successfully seeing to what almost every economist in the world believes needs to be a further shift in the Chinese development model, growth model, away from capital-intensive growth, infrastructure development, basically, and export-led growth off of that infrastructure to one that's more consumer-driven. That's important. And other, of course, is the dwindling overall population of China. You would have seen the news recently that for the first time in many, many decades, China's population actually shrunk in 2022. But more importantly, not just the overall downsizing of the Chinese population, but the working population, income earning population relative to the elderly, the retired. Structural economic challenges are looming, and most economists believe are going to be real problems for China to overcome. So the question is, how do they do that? And for many, the approach that Xi Jinping is apparently taking of introducing a more statist or even party role into how the economy is managed is the wrong way to go. But why would he do this? I guess there are several explanations for it. One is obviously that he believes, I think fervently, that the party needs to have a more influential and powerful role in the Chinese economy, as well as in its overall governance structure, because only the party can be trusted to maintain control, to have the organizational capacity to drive what he calls the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And maybe ultimately, the party needs to be involved because if it's not, other forces like market forces or private business sources, civil society, might come to be more powerful or even challenge the Communist Party. So I think that's a sort of a political motivation behind what we're seeing in terms of party involvement within the economy. But it may be also, and this I'm a little bit less confident in saying, but I think it may be that Xi Jinping truly believes in the sort of the Marxist model. The party needs to support a greater statist role within the economy in order to move it towards a sort of next level of socialism, or at least at a minimum, needs to play a greater role for fear that if the state is not more involved, if it's not doing what it can to regulate the economy and the financial sector and so forth, some bad things might happen, not just sort of loss of control, but, you might see concentration of wealth in too few hands. You might see widening income gaps within the society. You might see, widening economic prosperity on the coast versus, inland provinces, or cities versus rural areas, all of which would run against the grain of a kind of, socialist thinking about how the economy should be working, and could also, cause political problems down the track. So, I think that's how they're thinking about it. There may be a hope and an expectation that the success story of the 80s and 90s, where you had, relatively firm political control on the one hand, but a successful capitalist economic dynamic on the other, can be continued going forward and sort of create a new Chinese model for economic development that would defy, sort of the more Western notions of how developmental success should proceed.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I'm definitely one of those who think that this is kind of the opposite sort of solution when China is facing the type of challenges it is, to go back to more state control, which may not be able to respond to the market as well. But I think you really have a good explanation of why she feels like this is the right policy to pursue, and only time will tell, I guess, whether it's effective or not.
I mean, it's going to be very interesting to follow, and I think the next 5 to 10 years, which are probably will precisely overlap the next period of Xi's leadership, are going to be critical for China grappling with these large structural challenges. We'll get more signals over the course of this year. There'll probably be some new important appointments in some of the economic portfolios. Traditionally, in the Chinese Communist Party calendar, the third plenum of what will be the 20th Party Congress, the third plenum, is normally one that deals with issues of economic reform. And that's going to take place in October or November of this year. So I think maybe some of the signals coming out of that will give us a clearer picture of what to expect on some of these big picture economic questions going forward.
Yeah, that's really good to keep in mind. And I'll definitely be paying attention to that. And, there's also the issue of the international response. There's increasing wariness of, private companies operating in the US or elsewhere because of what control the party actually has through its corporate governance. So I just find that all of these are really interesting issues that, like you said, I think.
You raise a really good point there, Anita, and we haven't even touched on that quite yet. And you were asking what might be motivating Xi to sort of take this more statist and party-led approach to the economy. Another factor, that we haven't begun to discuss is the understanding in China that some of the more traditional inputs to the Chinese economic success story are going to be more and more difficult to access going forward. And what do I mean by that? I mean foreign capital, foreign technology, foreign know-how, and foreign markets. All of those are going to, I think we can all understand, are going to shrink going forward for political and even some economic reasons. And all of that in spite of the rhetoric coming out of Beijing, that we're open for business, we welcome foreign investment, and so on. So the party leadership understands that if they just let the market forces work as they'd like, there's going to be trouble ahead, because both the political and economic market forces are in some ways moving away from China and looking elsewhere, and only then through sort of party mandated allocation of resources, party driven strategic economic policies, can Chinese economy avoid the worst of the kinds of outcomes that are likely down the track as access to those foreign economic inputs become harder and harder.
Yeah, I think that's a really good perspective. And I think maybe ironic is not the right word, but in doing that, they also make it harder to get those inputs because there is so much suspicion now about how it'll be used, how trustful are these private enterprises. So, yeah, so I think that's really interesting.
It's a major contradiction. You're absolutely right. And we'll see how it gets resolved.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to switch to diplomacy a little bit. Under Xi, a new brand of strident and assertive diplomacy, colloquially referred to wolf warrior diplomacy, has emerged. And that's led to diplomatic exchanges that have heightened tensions with the United States and other nations wary of China's goals. Do you think the shift is domestically driven, or do you think that he feels like it's the best way to accomplish his international objectives?
Well, thanks for that. It's a very interesting phenomenon, and it has been reined in a little bit. I think 2022 was a difficult year for China on the international front, in part because of pushback and unhappiness with wolf warrior diplomacy, but there were a range of other things that China is doing internationally that are unwelcome. And so I think there's been a bit of a recalibration of it, but it's still out there. And I think when we on the outside try to understand what's the motivation, what's the source of this more assertive and even insulting diplomatic behavior, we scratch our heads and wonder why. Because, of course, our understanding is that diplomats, persons, public-facing representatives of the People's Republic of China, we would have thought have as their primary objective to improve China's image, to create friendly and constructive relationships with the countries in which they're posted, and try to steer those governments and societies toward greater alignment, right, with China's preferred outcomes. And of course, that is part of their job. But the wolf warrior diplomacy seems to sort of, belie all of that. And so we ask ourselves, what is going on here? And I think, the quick answer to your question, I think, gets you, is it a domestic issue or is it actually a part of international strategy? We have to look to the former as a better explanation for it. And what do I mean? It's because the rhetoric that comes out of wolf warrior diplomacy isn't primarily intended for consumption by the foreign audiences, although they surely understand that it will be consumed by the foreign audience, and usually in a negative way. The primary audience of wolf warrior diplomacy is the home audience, the domestic audience in China, to be able to sort of send the signal back home that we're defending Chinese dignity, we're demanding respect for the Chinese nation and peoples, we're pushing back on the insults and offenses that we're feeling coming at us from especially Western, but not exclusively Western societies and governments, and that we're standing up for our rights. The foreign ministry in Chinese is the Wai Guo Bu, but oftentimes in the social media space in China, sometimes it's insultingly referred to as the Mai Guo Bu, which is selling out the country department rather than the foreign affairs department or ministry. So, in the same way that we sometimes see in the United States, diplomats are often criticized or can be criticized, for being too close, right, to the countries in which they're posted, or that they don't really represent, American interests, but rather are trying to engage too closely with foreign interests. The same dynamics occurring in China. And this has compelled diplomats, to sort of be holier than thou and to try and demonstrate their fealty to the party and to the interests by coming out with some of these very over-the-top types of statements. And it shouldn't surprise us too much if we really understand and listen to what Xi Jinping and even the topmost diplomats in China are saying to the diplomatic corps about what their job is. And it's very clear in public statements that their number one job is to uphold and promote the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. That's their job. That's their number one job. And, with that in mind, I think the wolf warriors have to speak in ways sometimes that demonstrate that is indeed the priority that they're giving to their work. I don't think it helps. I think it's obviously created a backlash across a lot of societies internationally, but apparently the calculation has been made that the risks entailed in acting this way, in making those sorts of statements, in undermining their credibility within the societies they're posted, those risks are worth it because the gains that they believe they're making in terms of bolstering their status, either as individuals or as an institution amongst their home audience, and particularly with the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, is more important.
Yeah, I think that's important. Even as you're saying this, just thinking about how you untangle the personal incentives for the diplomats to show almost, I guess, their patriotism and make their calculations that way, and how much of it is the Communist Party trying to speak more generally to their domestic audience. So I think, yeah, thank you. One thing that I really love about your work, and unfortunately we just barely have time to touch on it, but your research is about understanding the domestic drivers of China's foreign policy. And how do you feel, just in a very general context, that in doing so and being able to understand China from this domestic perspective helps China's neighbors and the U.S. can avoid military conflict?
Well, I think it's obviously extremely, very, very important. And one of the big jobs of the Center for China Analysis that's recently established and that I'm leading right now is we call it trying to understand China from the inside out. And so we're trying to throw what resources we have in terms of our expertise, our Chinese language abilities, our experiences in China, networks there, relationships and so on, trying to leverage all of that in a way to better understand what's happening inside China, and then translate that knowledge in a way to help understand what China's up to, both at home and abroad, so we can respond more effectively. So it's very, very important. Easy to say, though, harder to do. I mean, China remains in many, many respects, and especially in terms of, elite politics and decision-making, very much a black box. There's a lot of big challenges in really trying to know what's going on at the uppermost reaches of power. And, of course, the information availability seems to be getting more and more narrowed. So whereas maybe 20 or 30 years ago, there was a great deal more information available, I wouldn't call it transparency exactly, but a great deal more information and willingness of individuals and institutions to share information with outsiders. A lot of that's being cut back these days. And so conducting this kind of work is certainly harder than it's been since the reform era in China. And you'd probably have to go back to the 50s or 60s to find a similarly challenging time for outsiders to try and unpack and understand what's going on. But there is information. That's one of the important things our center is going to try to demonstrating. If you know where to look, if you dig in the right places, if you are able to triangulate in a smart way, there is data, there are archives, there are sources of digitized information. And of course, there continues to be the old-fashioned way, going to China and continuing to have the kinds of meetings and interactions that will help inform your thinking. It's not ideal, but I think we're well positioned to try and do it. And it is key, because otherwise we risk a number of things. We risk either overestimating China's capacity, kind of treat it as a monolith on an ever onward and upward trajectory, without understanding the inside challenges and bureaucratic complications and stovepiping and bad decisions and poorly resourced strategies and so on and so on and so on that afflict every major government around the world and does China as well. Or we sort of underestimate. We believe that There are just too many challenges and China's never going to overcome them. And so therefore we can be more complacent. I don't think that's a smart way either. So we need to keep thinking about what's happening inside China, using all the resources we can, even under more challenging circumstances, to have that inside-out perspective and help inform policy as we go forward into what's likely to be a more difficult and challenging relationship with China in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. Do you have any concerns about the restriction of data? I know a lot of the younger scholars of China have been very frustrated because the same data sources that their predecessors may have been able to get through traveling through China or other means of access no longer open to them. I know quite recently, China has said that it's like dissertations, Chinese language dissertations database is no Western institutions are no longer going to have access to that. So is that a concern, particularly with your focus?
It's a huge concern. I mean, all of us who have university affiliations would be aware of the recent announcement from one of the major Chinese digitized cases of continuing removal of certain vast collections of information which had earlier been readily available. And you mentioned one of them, PhD dissertations being undertaken across all fields in China will no longer be accessible to the outside world through this particular major database. So the students of China, young persons getting into the field who want to do advanced research and study are facing growing challenges. And not just in terms of access to data, which of course is huge, but field work, ability to find willing partners in mainland China who will take on foreign scholars to work in certain areas that might be deemed sensitive in some way or another. And this is really just a reflection of the larger, I guess I'd say, mistrust that has infused China's relationship with many, not just Western countries, but with the outside world more generally, particularly in the Xi Jinping era. Rising distrust, concern, fear, paranoia even in some ways, that is going to make it harder and harder for the outside world to understand what's happening in China, but particularly harder and harder for those younger scholars that we all need. We want to encourage, and we have to have if we're going to remain on top of our understanding of China. It's going to make it harder and harder for them to get the same kind of work done. There are alternatives, of course, and their supervisors are working hard and trying to provide them, but it's going to be more difficult to undertake certain types of study in China going forward.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I think this increasing lack of trust on both sides is really problematic because of once you cut off those information sources on both or either side, and it makes it harder it just seems to increase the level of mistrust and tensions. And instead of being able to have the knowledge to find a way to lessen tensions.
You're absolutely right. It increases mistrust. And of course, it almost by definition increases misunderstanding because you just don't know. And that, certainly in the policy world, that leads to worst casing when you don't really know.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Like I said, I really enjoy your work and I've learned so much just talking to you. And I know people listening to this will as well. And I really, really appreciate. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Anita. It's just been a great opportunity. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you at some future date.
Me too. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed listening to the interview. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and follow us on Twitter at Global Kellogg or me at AR Kellogg. And I want to shout out too that we have now an Instagram account that you can find at KGP_podcast.
Ooh, exciting Instagram.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as usual, you can still reach us by email. So Anita at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan, at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com. And as always, see all the show notes for the articles we discussed in this episode. And if you like this show, please take the time, tell your friends, and share it on social media. It's a simple, quick, and free way to support the show.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.